want to move from someone who's got a product in the supply chain to someone further in the supply chain, a buyer in the supply chain. It's a large CPG company. Our next speaker is going to be Anshuman Bhatia, who's the Transformational Partnerships Lead at Mars, where he drives global strategic partnerships for Mars snacking across the supply chain. With over 20 years' experience in tech and management, he is helping Mars adopt industry-leading practices that reduce the carbon footprint of Mars supply chain. He has a unique range of experience in building multi-lateral partnerships, driving innovation, and understanding what's needed on the ground to deliver impactful change. Please.
Thanks for the introduction as well as the warm welcome here. It would behoove me if I didn't mention I was coming into this summit as more of a participant, and when the last minute invite came, Joe basically suggested that I could potentially be on the panel. So feel like being in a very esteemed crowd, not necessarily from the dairy industry, but like I'm privileged to represent what Mars is doing in the dairy sustainability space, and it is a fascinating story. And as we just heard a few of other esteemed colleagues mention, right? Like if you have a good story to tell, tell it. So a little bit about Mars, just giving some perspective in terms of the company itself. It is a family-owned company. It's 100+ years, very principles-based, and some of the principles that basically would resonate in terms of what we have heard over the last couple of days in this conference as well. There are pillars that we basically still talk about, and quality, efficiency. Some of these things are basically the building blocks when you think about our thinking around in sustainability space itself. How do we think about our role as a responsible citizen? We are looking at with the world that we want tomorrow starts with the way that we do the business today. So I think from that principle-based approach, sustainability has been kind of ingrained in the way we do business. And some of this also stems from how we started talking about and thinking about this as a family-owned company is we need to put the money where our mouth is. And so it starts with actually incentivizing our senior leaders and baking in sustainability metrics and performance around it as incentive structure and from a long-term compensation perspective. So that's very unique in the CPG space when you think about it from that perspective too. And that has resulted in outcomes, right? So what we think about from a dairy sustainability point of view is it's cutting methane, not corners, right? And so from that perspective, how are we putting our emphasis in terms of the initiatives that we are driving? We announced last year a program working with key strategic partners across the ecosystem of investing about $47 million directly into the supply chain. And this is essentially tied to on-farm interventions that are happening with the key suppliers, and then essentially they're leveraging that capital pool to incentivize farmers in terms of adopting some of those practices. So if we look at some of the topics that we were thinking about from a talking perspective included, where do we think we have the goals that we have set? So it's very progressive when you think about it, the kind of metrics that we have put ourselves accountable for in achieving. So one of them being by 2030, we will be reducing our dairy GHG footprint by 50%. Now, why dairy? As a candy company, I learned from actually like what's the role dairy plays overall in our formulations. Primarily, when you think about it, cocoa has been the primary driver from the sustainability footprint that Cargill has. So if we move to the next slide, that will give you a flavor in terms of the goals that we have set for ourselves. So from overall goals perspective, 50% reduction by 2030, and we cannot do it by ourselves. So we recognize that this is essentially, I think Paul mentioned in the prior panel, that we need, as a CPG company, most of this is coming in as a Scope 3 emission. And we need the to work across our partnering ecosystem to be able to kind of achieve those goals. When we think about these progressive metrics that we are looking at in achieving, how do we go about doing it, right? So if you move to the next slide here, we think about the overall spectrum in terms of the footprint that we have of our current carbon footprint. And when you look at it, ingredients is the one that stands out as the primary one. And as a chocolate or confectionery manufacturer, from the ingredient perspective, cocoa is one of the bigger contributors, and we are addressing that over the years, and then now moving on to dairy, which is the second largest contributor. And if we don't move the needle on that, that would become the largest contributor to our overall supply chain and GHG footprint that we have associated with it. So our suppliers are key to achieving, and many of you are here, and we are essentially looking at working with you in establishing different programs. And the strategy is essentially threefold. So if you look at, if you don't mind moving to the next slide, the dairy being critical, so how do we look at dairy overall? So we have this Moving Dairy Forward initiative that is anchored around these principles around partnering. And when we think about from a perspective of dairy itself, moving on to the next slide, the three pillars around this is partnerships, on-farm interventions, and really influencing the industry both through communication, stakeholder management, as well as advocacy and engaging with our partners across the supply chain. So in terms of some of the work that has happened, and being a global company, we are looking at partnering within each of the different regions with the key suppliers that we have. And as part of the Moving Dairy Initiative, we announced partnerships with Fonterra, Land of Lake, that you would be aware of, as well as in Europe, we have Friesland Campina and Interfood as our strategic partners. And they are deploying the capital that we have agreed upon through agreed upon sourcing contracts to directly put those as on-farm interventions. And depending upon the region that we are operating in, those interventions might differ. So in the case of US, one of the projects that just basically got launched last month was with Land of Lake here in the state of California. We have announced as well as the Farmer Forward program that came in with Fonterra. That is almost $27 million of investment over the next 5 years, resulting in about 150,000 metric tons of CO2 equivalent reduction in 5 years. If you look at part of the conversation is really engaging and understanding how do we think about beyond 2030 going to net zero. And as we have heard from some of the esteemed colleagues here, there are solutions that we are really trying to drive across the value chain. And when you think about from a dairy-centric perspective, that don't still exist. So we have also thought about from that perspective, putting in an accelerator that can help incubate different ventures, specifically focused around these specific opportunities that we have around dairy-centric emissions and looking at the different technologies. So Mars announced a program called Unreasonable Foods, which is really focused on sustainability and driving that across different pillars, one of them being dairy. And we had identified a red seaweed-based venture called Sea Forest, which is based out of the Tasmania region, and have had trial works that are happening in commercial farms as well. Now, when you try to replicate that model in the US, as we heard in one of our initial panels, we come across challenges from a regulatory perspective, and those are the things that we want to tackle and understand what are the key unlocks there that can allow us to run pilots with our partners in these different geographies and really address the barriers that might be related to regulations as well. So from our perspective, these solutions, they need to make sure they're efficacious as well as safe. As a family-owned company with 100-year-old established brands, safety is a compromise we cannot just make. And so that's one of the critical components that we need to factor in, and some of the reasons that we are looking at technology pathways beyond feed additives as well, whether it be into the wearable space, whether it be into the vaccine route. We need these solutions accelerated and really open to hearing all the viewpoints and approaches that this audience can provide for us to accelerate some of those solutions. So with that, I'll pass it back to you.